Once upon a time, there was a young boy and his name was Tom Moody. And he worked at the brewery. He was an apprentice there. He didn't get to do the fun jobs. He didn't get to brew the beer or taste the beer. What he had to do was he had to go and collect the sacks of malt from the farms and bring them back to be brewed into beer. And to do this, he had a horse. And Tom loved horses. He loved watching them run past. He loved thoroughbreds and loved watching them jump over things. But sadly, the horse he had to transport the malt wasn't one of those horses. It was a cart horse. She was called Nellie, and she didn't go much faster than plodding pace. So she would plod along, and he'd dream of being on a racehorse, could go quickly. One day, he was coming back from collecting the malt, and the horse was laden down with malt, and he saw a gate. He saw the gate, and it was just quite a low one, and he wished he was on a horse that could jump over it. And then once the idea got into his head, he couldn't get it out. He was going to make Nellie jump the fence. Now, Nellie didn't know that this was his idea yet. She was happy that he'd stopped. She was chewing on grass, feeling quite content, when suddenly he started kicking her and hitting her with a stick, and she started moving forward because that's what he wanted. When she reached the gate, she was not going to jump over it, so she stopped. And Tom sighed. He turned her back around and ready to give her another run up for the gate. And this time Nellie actually got up a bit of pace, and she began to go faster and faster and faster. But when she got to the gate, she stopped. Tom didn't stop though. He went right over her head and landed on the other side of the gate in a cowpat. And then he decided to try one more time. Tom was stubborn. He wasn't one for giving up. And so he readied the horse, and he readied himself, and he got back on. He started to shout encouragement, and she was just getting there. And what he didn't realise while he was doing this was that someone was watching him. And that person was George Forrester, and he owned the stables that were used for the hunt. And he was watching this young boy on a cart horse trying to jump a fence, and he was watching it. And I'm sure if he had been in the modern times, he would have got his phone out and tried to film it, because he knew this was going to go wrong. But Tom readied himself again, and he hit the horse and he shouted encouragement, and this time the horse was as surprised as he was when she jumped over the fence. And, well, Tom was very pleased with himself, and George Forrester, the Lord, was very surprised. And he knew that he wanted this boy to work in his stables, for someone who can make a cart horse jump over a fence should be able to do quite well with hunting horses. And so he went to the brewery and he asked Tom to become the stable boy. And so Tom worked at the stables, and he started just with the menial jobs, the shoveling out all the horse poo and doing all that. But soon he got to work with the hunters that he always wanted, the beautiful horses that were fast on their feet and willing to do whatever he asked them. And then the whipper-in of the hunt died. Now the whipper-in of the hunt is the person who rides on a horse, controlling all the hounds, making sure that they chase over after the fox and they get distracted by other smells. And George knew he needed a new whipper-in, and he knew that the person to do that would be Tom. Because he knew Tom was great with horses, but he wasn't sure how he was with dogs. And so he went to Tom. He said, "Tom, I've left something in the kennels. Would you go and get it?" And Tom didn't even know what the something was, but he knew he had to obey, and so he went into the kennels. And now the hunting dogs, they were not aggressive, but they can get very excited. And these are all beagles, so they're kind of this high. And there were about 100 of them coming at him and jumping at him, nipping his ankles and running round him. And he just couldn't count it anymore. And he said, "Sit!" And all the dogs sit. They sat and they looked at him. And at that moment, he knew, well, at that moment, George knew that Tom was the person to be the whipper-in. And then Tom got his dream job. He was riding with the hunt, and he was always with them as they went past, and they'd go from Broseley all the way to the Wrekin, coming past Apley, going along this road before it was made of tarmac when it was just dirt, and they'd be following the fox. And Tom was always the one to shout the loudest and ride the fastest. And time passed, and Tom grew older, and his friendship with George grew. And one day he got his own horse, a horse called Old Saul. Now, Old Saul would not let anyone else ride him but Tom. He would buck them off as quickly as he could. For Tom, he was as gentle as a lamb. And they would ride together, and people would hear Tom yelling, "Tally-ho!" and it would mix with the whinny of old Saul. But as time passed, things started to go wrong because Tom started to drink. Now, some people say that it was because Tom had worked in a brewery, but others say that it was because Tom always felt bad for the foxes after he'd killed them, because Tom cared for animals, and so he began to drink. And soon he was never quite steady on his feet, and he was slurring his words. But always when he was on the horse, when he was back in the hunt, he was himself again. But one day, the hunt was going on, and there's a rule in the hunt. You never go past the leader, you always let the leader control it. And the horses were running past Apley, and they were following the fox, and just as they reached the gate, the fox turned into Apley. And now the hunt was not allowed to go into Apley because they would grind up all the ground. But Tom, in the heat of the moment, turned his horse left and followed the fox, and all the hounds streamed after him. And after that day, Tom wasn't allowed to ride with the hunt anymore. And so he would sit in the pub and he would tell people stories of what he'd done, but he didn't feel alive anymore. And he knew that the time was coming when he was going to die. And so he called George Forrester to him and said, "George, I know I'm going to die soon. I can feel it. And what I'd really like when I died was if my horse could carry my body, and if old Saul could carry my body, and if round the grave would be all the brushes, all the tails of the foxes that I've killed. And if, when my body's lowered into the grave, the men could all call 3 cries of tally-ho." And George said, "Oh yes, of course I'll do that, Tom, of course I'll do that for you." And well, a little bit more time passed, and Tom did pass away. And they did all the things he asked. His body was carried on his horse, and the tails of the foxes were laid round the grave. And when the body was lowered into the grave, there were 3 calls of tally-ho. But that wasn't the end of the story, because Tom's ghost did not rest easy. It didn't stay in his grave. Because whenever they went on the hunt, whenever the hunt went past, they'd suddenly hear cries of tally-ho, that distinctive cry that sounded like Tom's. And they were sure they could hear the whicker of old Saul, his horse. And suddenly, sometimes, the dogs would veer in a strange direction, as if someone else was controlling them. But then, more time passed, and people got used to it. They thought this had always happened. New people joined, and they were sure that they were just mishearing the call of tally-ho. And so they forgot about the ghost of Tom Moody. Some years later, there was an old woman. Her name was Molly Tart. And she was very suspicious. She was one of those people that wouldn't walk under ladders, or would get really worried if she broke a mirror or saw a black cat. And she worked at the gardener of Apley, and her pride and joy were the roses that she grew. She grew different varieties. She grew pink ones and purple ones and red ones with exotic names like Peach Blossom and Snapdragon, Harrison Weir. And she loved her roses, but one of her superstitions was that if she was coming out of the house in the morning and the first person she saw was female, she would just go back to her house and she wouldn't talk to anyone. She'd just stay in for the rest of the day worrying if her roses were going to get damaged. But on one particular morning she came out. The first person she saw was an old tramp, and she'd never been so happy to see one in her life because he was a man. And she meant she could go, and she went to Apley and she began working on her roses. And as she was working, she heard the sounds of the hunt coming past. She heard the cries of the men and the sound of the horns and the dogs barking. But she knew that they weren't allowed to come in to Apley. And so she stayed working on her roses, clipping them, and then a flash of red went past. She realised it was the fox, and she felt quite happy because she always felt sorry for the foxes. So the fox went past and she knew no one would come. Then she heard the sound of hooves. And they seemed to be coming closer, but she knew that nobody would dare come into the grounds of Apley. But the sound of hooves came closer and closer until eventually she looked up. And there, riding towards her, was a man on a big black horse. And she jumped out of the way as he trampled through her precious roses, and the pinks and the purples and the reds of the flowers were scattered everywhere, and he rode off into the distance after the fox. And then Molly Tart was angry. She was as angry as she'd ever been. And she went up to the Lord of Aptley. And she marched up to him and she said, "Someone from the hunt, someone on a big black horse has ridden through my roses. They've destroyed the rose garden, they've destroyed all my work. I need you to talk to them. That man needs, I think hanging's too good for him, actually." But the Lord looked at her in confusement and he said, "But there isn't any black horses on the hunt. There hasn't been a black horse on the hunt for years and years. We only use the brown type now." She said, "Are you sure? I'm sure it was a man on a black horse." And he said, "Well, come show me your roses." And she took him, she marched back to where her roses were. And they were perfectly fine, they were completely intact. Not a single petal was out of place. And because she was old, the Lord of Aptley just decided she'd gone a bit crazy. But we know, and I think Molly Tart did as well, that it was the ghost of Tom Moody.